Welcome to this national webinar for CHSP providers. This session is being convened by COTA Victoria and Seniors Rights Victoria as part of the CHSP Sector Support and Development Initiative. We'd like to acknowledge the funding provided by the Commonwealth Government for our work in this area. We are pleased to have with us today staff from CHSP services across the country, together with consumers, educators and other experts to contribute to our discussion. We'll introduce those on our panel a little later. But today is the second of two sessions we are running on the inclusive use of digital and non-digital communications as we release some guidance for CHSP providers to inform your work going forward. These two webinars were essentially the same, but we do have some different presenters for our panels, although we do have one that's followed through, which is really, really great, and you'll hear all their perspectives a little later on. Before we start, there are a few housekeeping issues we need to run through. So first of all, I'd like to note that the session is being recorded for open access after the event. We will be releasing both this presentation and our predecessor presentation as well. We will have a Q&A session later on, and I'd really encourage you to, as we go along, to put your questions into the Q&A function on this Zoom webinar. We'll keep the webinar chat for any comments, and again, we encourage them, please do put them in there. But if you have any questions, please do put them into that Q&A function. We'll give you an opportunity to do it later, but we always find it's great to get those questions in as we get going. But most importantly, I'd also like to start by moving on to an acknowledgement of country. So we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet from, which for those of us in the COTA Victoria office is on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations. We acknowledge all First Nations peoples and their lands on which we live and work. We pay our respects to their continuing culture and all elders past and present who have taught their children, adults and communities for over 65,000 years, the oldest living culture in the world. We commit ourselves to the ongoing journey of reconciliation. Now on to the program for today. So it is fairly straightforward. We'll be speaking briefly about the work we've done to inform the session, starting with a summary of some key research about older people and digital engagement. Then we'll begin to outline the findings from our own consumer consultations. The next part will be to briefly walk you through the resource guide that we have developed before moving on to a panel discussion and an audience Q&A session. As I said earlier, please feel free to put comments all throughout our presentation, and please do put the questions into the Q&A just so we don't run out of time at the end. But we will hold all other audience input until the Q&A session unless critical. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Martin Turnbull, who is our Senior Policy Advisor at COTA Victoria and Seniors Rights Victoria, and who has been the brains and the leader behind this project, and who will take you through the rest of our presentation. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks very much, Ben, and welcome everybody. Thanks so much for being with us today. We might just flip to the next slide. Okay. Thank you very much, Steve. So today's webinar is really a core part of a slightly larger project that we've been doing here at COTA Victoria over the last 3 or 4 months or so. The aim of the project is really pretty straightforward. It's to identify and then share what we hope will be some really practical advice on how CHSP providers can best meet the communication needs and indeed preferences of older people who are or may be not very well digitally engaged. And it's important that we say may not be, because we just may not know the status of their digital exclusion. The key project activities have included some consultation groups with older people, and we'll give you a bit of a taste for what we found through those groups in a moment. We did a bit of literature review and had some discussion with some experts in this area. We then developed the guide, as Ben indicated, we'll speak about in a moment. And then finally, after today's session, we'll have a little bit of opportunity to seek some feedback from the sector about how they've seen the guide and whether it meets the sort of needs they're seeing in their own work. In doing this work, perhaps if we just flip to the next slide, we're really keen to ground this in what we know about the level of digital engagement and indeed digital exclusion of older Australians generally in the community. And as you will be aware, no doubt, there have been a number of very useful surveys over recent years that have given us some insight into this. I'll show you some particular statistics from a couple of those surveys in a moment, but it is important to say up front that there are some severe limitations on this kind of research, not the least of which is whether these surveys are done online themselves and therefore can be restrictive of the sort of people who respond. A few fundamental points really emerge, though, from the research. And I guess at the most general level, we want to say there's absolutely no place for reductionist stereotypes of older people as somehow unable or unwilling to embrace digital communications. Older Australians, like the rest of us, have a great diversity of access skills and levels of comfort with technology, and overall, a pretty large majority are embracing new technology to at least some extent. At the same time, it is very clear that many face some really significant barriers, and not only practical barriers, but also express some really clear preferences for non-digital alternatives being available, particularly in service delivery contexts. A couple of slightly more nuanced things that come out of the research that we think are really important to note. First of all, that digital disengagement or exclusion does not necessarily reflect the lack of competence or skill, or indeed access to technology. We know that while skill and accessibility are really important, there's also a huge set of social, cultural, and indeed emotional factors that really dictate and influence older people's use of digital communications. A related point that's come through, I think, quite strongly is that access to technology does not imply active use. And so, for example, we know that lots of older people do actually have email addresses, but they may not actually actively use them, or they might only use them in a very limited way. The good news from a lot of the research is that there is a sizable group of older Australians who feel currently fairly uncomfortable with this technology, but are very open and interested in improving their skills and looking at how they might embrace it more significantly. The final thing I just wanted to say about the research is that there's a fairly consistent identification of those factors that are correlated with low digital engagement. And these won't be of any surprise to you because they're also pretty much characteristics of a lot of CHSP clients. So lower levels of education, financial insecurity, poor mental or physical health, and various types of disability come through time and time again as the factors we need to focus on. If I can just get you to focus for a moment on this slide, which comes from the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, which you might know is probably one of the best recurring sources of data in this area. It's got the advantage of being a national survey that's done both online and in non-digital form. It covers questions about access, affordability, and competence, and uses those questions to create an overall index of inclusion. I think the main point I wanted to make with this slide is just the incredibly stark age gradient that you can see. So as you go across the columns, if you focus just on the top black part, that's the group of people who are classified as highly excluded digitally. And we can see that this increases from virtually nobody in the 18 to 34-year-old age group, rising to 12% in those aged 55 to 64, and up to 42% in those over 75. And in fact, if you combine those seen as highly excluded and those moderately excluded, it's a massive 3/4 of that older age group. The next slide is a little bit complex. This is reproduced in our, just if we go back one, Steve, thanks. This is reproduced in the guide, and I hope you'll be able to review it in more detail there. But this is very recent, hot off the press data from COTA's State of the Older Nations survey, released just a few weeks ago. And for the third time now, that survey has included a group of questions about digital engagement. It pretty much confirms what other research has told us, but it's usefully presented in terms of the level of comfort that respondents have in using digital communications technology. And you can see on that first line there that 8% of those in their 70s and 11% of those in their 80s express that they have very low levels of comfort with digital technology. And bear in mind again that this is a survey that is done online, so it is a bit limited. You might see then on the second line of circles there, some of those factors around disability, poor health, low financial insecurity. And the survey pretty much suggests that having one of those vulnerabilities doubles that figure in terms of low levels of comfort. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of this particular survey, though, is what it tells us about the feelings that older people are expressing on these issues. So about 2/3 of the respondents to this survey agree that they are having to rely primarily on digital communications for social connection and indeed for the use of support services. Yet 29% agree strongly that they feel left behind in a so-called age of technology. 2/3 agree strongly that technology needs to be better designed for older people. And nearly half agree strongly that it's just too hard to keep up with changing technology. The final piece of this particular survey that I think is useful for us today is the finding that 57% showed a high level of interest in improving their ICT skills, which is really terrific. But we also need to bear in mind that 16% said they had little or no interest. So we've got a sizable group of people in that older population who we really need to work with in a somewhat different way. So we're going to hear in just a little bit directly some consumer perspectives, but I wanted to give you a bit of a summary of what we heard through our focus groups. These groups were not trying to be representative, but we did 5 focus groups of around 15 people each, a mix of older people, mostly in their 70s and 80s, some already CHSP clients, quite a few carers for partners who are CHSP clients. Overall, the message that came through pretty strongly is that most had a reasonable level of confidence, at least with common technologies, but that coexisted with quite a bit of discomfort about how services are relying on digital communications. While most of the people around the table could recognise and acknowledge the benefits of technology, For quite a few, there was this sense that, in the words of one respondent, this has become a blocker rather than an aid to life. So that's a pretty strong statement from somebody about their feeling about this technology. One of the really strong messages that came through was that consumers think services need to be much more alert to the impact of client health on their ability to use digital communications, and need to be much more conscious of the need to assess and then regularly reassess the methods of communication they use with each client. One of the bugbears, I think, that some of these older people expressed was the failure in many cases from CHSP services to actually ask them about their communication preferences, and the assumption that was often made that they could access some support from their families. The reality, as they emphasised to us, was that sometimes they just didn't have those family members, or sometimes their family members were quite antipathetic to their need to improve their ability to use these technologies. Above all, I think the message we heard was that consumers want a better two-way communication capacity. They want the ability to explain their needs to service providers in more detail, and they certainly want the capacity to use communication tools to give feedback to providers more consistently. The next slide just digs down a little bit more into some specific issues, and I'm sure we'll pick up some of these in our panel discussion. But it's important to acknowledge that consumers had quite a bit of anxiety about things like scams, privacy breaches, and simply, again, in the words of one participant, the consequences of clicking the wrong button. And these were not just minor anxieties, they were really factors that were severely limiting their willingness to use the communication tools in some cases. Quite a few participants said that they had difficulty finding appropriate help desk type support, and they thought that was a big area that we could improve on. And many felt that some of the digital communications really ignored key challenges facing older people. So that might have been simple things like typing skills, concentration, patience, volume control, visual acuity. And on top of that, they felt that some, but not all, digital communications were lacking the capacity for repetition, for checking in with users on their comprehension. It's probably important just to emphasise on the other side of the coin that there was also concern about the ways in which some more traditional communications are being used. Much as they're valued, some of the participants talked about being swamped with paper-based forms, and certainly complained quite a bit about some of the phone-based communication increasingly involving long wait times, complex trio options, and so forth. And finally, the participants were very conscious of the effort that CHSP providers and many others are putting into providing training on the use of this technology. But at the same time, they felt that a lot of that training was actually a little bit too technical and not well based on their own identified needs. And that would include some of those social, cultural and emotional factors that I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about in a moment. So at this point, it's my pleasure to give you a bit of a sneak preview of the resource guide. As Ben mentioned, we have developed. We're, I guess, more or less officially launching this today, and you'll be able to find it on our website, and we'll give you a bit more information about that before we close today. The guide is being produced as a standalone document. It runs to about 16 pages, so it's fairly brief, but more than just a top line resource. It does go into a fair bit of detail about different aspects of this challenge, how it plays out in different parts of service delivery, from how you promote your services in the broader community to how you onboard clients, how you might work with clients with particular disabilities around their communication needs, and several other aspects of program delivery. Perhaps just on the next slide, thanks, Steve. We've really targeted this resource to a range of different levels in CHSP provider organisations. So there's some material that will be, we hope, very much geared to people in management positions, people in direct service delivery roles, and those with some particular responsibility for communications. We've put a little bit of effort into making the resource look and feel engaging, and it's certainly very colourful. That includes what I think are some really lovely photographs that I hope will really reinforce the fact that while this is all about technology to some extent, it's also very much about people interacting, providers, clients, working together, using that technology to communicate. One point I did want to make about the resource is just to emphasise that it doesn't go into particular detail about the use of inclusive, non-discriminatory language for different parts of the community. That's something which is certainly referred to in places, but we're conscious that there are a number of other really excellent resources out there that go to those issues, and you'll see some cross-reference to those resources. One of the things that we were very keen to do in this resource is to keep it very much grounded in the principles of the CHSP program. So the way in which communications tools are used, the different platforms that are used, can play out very directly to client outcomes and to the different ways in which we work with clients. So, for example, big emphasis on supported decision-making really needs communication tools that are going to be very strong on engaging the client, giving the client that opportunity to feedback and to ultimately make those decisions. So I hope that the guide will be of value. We're very keen to get your feedback. It is not trying to be absolutely comprehensive, and it's certainly not trying to be a detailed how-to manual. It's very much about how do we take a more strategic and holistic approach to some of these issues. We have also produced a simple one-page summary version, which is looks like this, and it's produced as a kind of tip sheet, 8 key points about things that we think CHSP providers should keep top of mind and put into practice, 8 points that we'd like you to think about not doing or being very conscious to avoid. So we hope that will be something you will pin up on notice boards and keep handy as you go about your work. There's just one other key part of the guide that I wanted to quickly talk through, which comes at the very back of the document, which is a brief set of indicators for how you might assess how well your agency is doing on these issues. And we were keen to include this really partly to emphasise that this really has to be seen as a whole of agency strategic responsibility. It's not something that individual care providers solve on their own, or indeed should be totally responsible for. So you can see some of these measures. We think they align pretty well with the aged care quality standards. There's probably a little bit more work to do to work out that alignment. They don't map one for one, but certainly they're very consistent. So we asked some questions about the public commitment to communication policies that the agency has put out there. We asked some questions for you to analyse what information and data you've drawn on and what data you're continuing to collect to really help make some informed decisions. We asked some questions in indicator 3 about what's the specific way in which these issues have been part of program review and design. Importantly, in indicator 4, we talk about staff training, both from the point of view of the proportion of staff who may have undertaken some form of training around effective use of communication tools, but also the staff capacity to actually empower and educate clients. Client engagement in indicator 5, it's really critical, given everything we've said about clients being in the driving seat here. And then finally, in indicator 6, some suggested measures around building these issues into the monitoring and evaluation, the quality control review processes that your agency uses. So I think we're pretty much on time now to move into our panel discussion. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome our 5 panelists today. I'm going to introduce them one at a time and throw them a couple of starter questions for them to speak to for 5 minutes or so each. And then we'll move into a bit of general discussion across the panel, pick up some of the key themes that have been raised, and we'll have plenty of time for audience Q&A. So as Ben outlined in opening, please, as you're listening, think of some questions and pop them in the Q&A box on the Zoom platform. So without further ado, let's introduce our first panellist, Gayle Osmond. Gayle heads the digital literacy program with Bridges Connecting Community, which is a non-government support service in the southeast of Melbourne. So she brings a very grounded perspective to the discussion today. Gayle, perhaps could we ask you to kick off with some comments about the journey that your agency has been on over some years in addressing these issues? What are the key trends that you've noticed? How, I guess, particularly has the pandemic intervened in progress here? And what's your sense of how the experience of clients in your area resonates with the sort of information we've run through already today?
Thanks, Martin. That's lovely. Thanks for the kind introduction. So yes, Bridges has been around for many, many years in the southeastern suburbs, and we have a consumer base of, anywhere up to 800 CHSP and HCP referred consumers, and we provide community transport and social support activities. A very, very small portion of those consumers would request information electronically because we do check that when we start with them during the intake process. Our journey really started when we had COVID arrive, as most people had discovered that there was a group of people that were largely unsupported and isolated during COVID. We didn't have a program prior to that, but we were able to quickly source some funding, and my role that existed quickly transitioned into offering support to our clients who were able to connect digitally and support them in learning programs like Zoom so that they could actually connect or FaceTime with family. So we address those issues sort of really as a matter of necessity in an attempt to keep our consumers contacted and not isolated during the pandemic. But those without devices or the ability to connect certainly remained isolated, and we weren't able to approach and deal with them until after lockdown. So one of the key trends that I've noticed over the since the pandemic would be that family members have recognised the need for consumers to actually be connected and have access to a device. So there's a large portion of people out there who have got hand-me-down devices, or families have purchased the latest whiz-bang device for them to use, and that they're expected to use it after 5 minutes of very quick instruction while they're cooking dinner. So it's been something that I've noticed a lot more. They have a lot of people with devices out there, but many have mentioned that it's still sitting on the kitchen bench. I don't know how to charge it. Or if they know how to answer a call, they've got limited functionality. They only know how to answer a call. So I think it's a bit of a paradox for older people who may have little to no digital skills or abilities, yet their everyday lives are becoming increasingly digitised. And that causes frustrations and anxieties for them to navigate. And in many cases, the aged care system is confusing enough without the added complexity of technology added to it. So I'd say that there's, in addition to the things you mentioned before, Martin, such as affordability and competency and access, there would be a lack of confidence, feeling hopeless, feeling embarrassed, that learning is too hard for them, fear that you've also touched on, and fear of being scammed. They would be sort of some of the main areas that prohibit older people from getting online. You've mentioned there, you asked the question about how consumers generally feel. So I think certainly there's a frustration within the consumer community about the way the world has digitised and that they've been left behind, or more so forced into being into a digital world when they simply don't want to or don't have the ability. So, for example, I know there are some providers out there who require their consumers to be using apps. You know, they don't know how to download the apps in many cases. So, and certainly not being questioned at the time of intake as to what their communication preferences would be. So I think sort of probably to take out of it, I think that if organisations can develop a corporate culture and processes and systems during intake that considers the needs of older people, there's another reason for that would be that you offer a better value proposition for your consumers and ultimately enhance that customer service and satisfaction because you're actually opening up and doing stuff that other services may not be doing. So, and older people want to be empowered, we all know that, and it's outlined in the aged care quality standards that they should be involved in making decisions about their care. But with services moving online, many find themselves excluded and disempowered, particularly if they can't rely on families and friends, or they don't even have a device.
Thanks, Gayle. That's terrific. Certainly one of the things we heard in our consultations were people saying, look, some good things happened during the pandemic. Tech was a lifesaver, but services shouldn't just default
yes.
to that going forward. They should take perhaps a more considered look at things. We'll keep moving and we'll come back to you in a moment, but it's great to have John Douch with us today. John's one of COTA Victoria's most experienced and skilled peer educators. And I'm sure John won't mind me saying that he's had his own concerns and doubts about using some forms of digital communications and certainly expresses a clear preference for face-to-face interaction. So, John, I wonder whether we could ask you to start by telling us a little bit about what you've experienced in terms of changing expectations on you to use different communications methods like the Zoom platform we're on today, of course. And has that been more of a plus or a minus for you in doing the sort of activity that you're so good at?
Okay, up to just prior to COVID, the 3, 4, maybe 5 years prior to that, I'd spent a lot of time touring around Victoria, delivering sessions relative to the programs that COTA was involved in. And one of them, of course, was My Aged Care. And I got down to the stages of where I was dealing with people face to face and assisting them in contacting My Aged Care and getting the ball rolling relevant to packages for them. I found that I can relate to people when I've got people in the room, but when I'm trying to do something on Zoom, and this, I'll give you a particular example. When COVID hit, we did a couple of sessions about My Aged Care and how to connect to My Aged Care and so on, and what it was all about. And I turned a 35, 40-minute session into 4 minutes. And it was just an absolute no-no. And I felt, once I'd finished, I felt quite physically sick and despondent about the way it had progressed. And that just showed to me that my best abilities was there talking to people face to face and getting what was going on in the room. And when you're just talking to a computer, like I'm doing now, I found it very, very difficult. I couldn't relate to the people who I was talking to. I couldn't relate to the people who I was listening to. And it made me feel that the information I was trying to put across was in fact not getting to where it should be. So I'm also involved with Omni, Older Men New Ideas. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a COTA program, and it's older men meeting once or twice a month. And Omni is Older Men New Ideas, and I like the new ideas bit because there's a number of new ideas that we've been discussing, especially recently in relation to non-digital and digital communication. And a lot of the gentlemen that I work with in Omni, in fact, are nowhere interested in dealing with digital communications. A, they know nothing about it. B, they have nobody to help them or assist them. And C, they don't see the need for it anyway. For years and years and years, they've been talking on the telephone, they've been writing letters, all of that sort of stuff, non-digital communications, and they're very, very happy with it. And my wife now has she stepped up from the Commonwealth Home Support Program package and is now on a level 3 package. And that level 3 package, the provider that provides that is very, very good in dealing with the fact that both my wife and I are not really competent on digital communications. So there's a lot of phone calls and a lot of slow mail stuff going backwards and forwards. That makes us very happy. But as soon as digital communication starts to rear its ugly head, unless I press the right button or get onto the right screen, I'm kind of lost. So I finally made the decision after all this time to turn around and upgrade my skills and my wife's skills as well. And we're going to be doing that with a technical expert at the City of Casey Library in Bunjil Place in Casey. And I've been rest assured that I can do as many sessions as I like, just so as I can upgrade myself. I'm kind of looking forward to it, but yeah, I think that's about it, Martin.
Thanks, John. Thanks for sharing that journey that you've been on. One thing I might just add in terms of the content of our guide that I didn't say earlier, there's a little section particularly devoted to the use of assistive technologies. And of course, for many people with various forms of disability, they'll need some form of assistive technology in order to optimally use some of these digital comms platforms. And we're keen just to keep a little bit of a distinction between what's a core communication tool, be it internet or social media or what have you, and the particular assistive technology that might be added to or attached. And that's something certainly we've been doing some separate work with CHSP providers around more generally in terms of their uptake of assistive technology for clients. It's my pleasure now to introduce Susan Newman, who joins us from COTA in Tasmania. Sue's the Positive Ageing Project Officer down there, and she brings to this discussion a wealth of experience in the aged care sector, and in particular some interest about responding to the needs of diverse communities within that sector. So I wonder, Sue, could we ask you to speak to us briefly about some of the issues that you've identified in making sure that the communication that aged care services undertake really suits consumers from a range of different backgrounds, and what are some of the considerations, perhaps on top of some of the technical things that we've touched on today that those providers need to take into account?
Thanks, Martin. I'm not from a call background, so I don't speak from that place. That's first thing I have to acknowledge. I have worked with some of those people from different communities, and what we've seen is that different pictures sometimes say different things to people. For example, we had one service that was using the smiley faces, that kind of, you know, that's a positive reaction, and the frown, which is a negative one. Well, there were some communities that laughed at those little images because they didn't actually understand what they were talking about. So it's really important that we know what images we're using. I think one of the most important things I've found is that we walk alongside people and we show them what we expect in terms of the devices they're using, the information they're giving us. There's so much information, it's an information overload. And you talked briefly about the overuse of, not the overuse, the dumping of lots of emails, pamphlets. And I spoke to a provider the other day because I've been focusing on quality standard number 6, which is feedback. So what we're wanting to do is educate people on how they actually give feedback. And one of the questions I asked the service provider is, do the people you're seeing know how to give feedback? And they kind of looked at me and said, oh, yes. And I said, and what's that? Can you just explain that to me? And they said, oh, we give them a whole heap of pamphlets. And I said, oh, okay. So, and how do they go about accessing those feedback mechanisms? Oh, I think there's something in the pamphlet. And I said, it's really hard for you to explain to someone how you're meeting quality standard number 6 if you don't know how to tell them how to access the information to feedback. So I suggested that people have a look, find that pamphlet and have a look at it and go through it themselves. So, and just to see how easy or not easy it is. But it's important that they talk people through that process, and people have many different service providers is the other thing. It's not just one service provider. So, if you've got a couple of providers, you've probably got a mountain of paper at home. You could probably, I don't know, build something with or something. But the other thing we found with some diverse communities is that they were using QR codes. So people during COVID got quite used to checking in and things like that. And so that was one way that some of the migrant populations were using as a feedback tool. So, and that took them to the particular platform to use.
Thanks, Sue. That's some really concrete, practical issues there, but also some important broader points. Certainly, I recall in our consultations, one gentleman from a Southeast Asian background saying, look, email is really the best thing for me because my English comprehension is not very good. And with email, I can take my time, work out what's being communicated and reply in his own time. So I guess the message from that might be that it's very much an individual thing, but there might be some lessons for different groups of people. We'll come back, I'm sure, to some of those issues, but let's keep moving. And I'm really glad that we're joined by Bernardo Figueiredo today, who's Associate Professor in Marketing at the RMIT University in Melbourne. But just to acknowledge that he's joining us very early in the morning from the UK for this webinar today. So Bernardo is a co-founder of the Shaping Connections initiative, which has been working very closely with the University of the Third Age. So it's a little bit of a parallel to our interest in the age support sector, but I think a lot of very close parallels. And one of the reasons we're very keen to have Bernardo along today is his interest in the way in which older people are socialised as consumers in their uptake of new technology. So I wonder, Bernardo, can we perhaps ask you to give us a quick account of what's driven the Shaping Connections project and what insights you've gained from that?
Yeah, of course, Martin. Hi, everyone. I was very happy to hear some of the previous, Gayle and John and Susan, because I think we are very much aligned with what we find. Just for disclosure, this whole journey started for me when trying to help my own mother, who was living in Brazil back then, and we were using technology to keep communication, and it realized how important that was to assist and to be close. So after that, we started developing with U3A, University of the Third Age, the Shaping Connections program. And the idea was to develop research around, to provide some evidence, evidence-based guidelines and tools that we could help others, not just older people, but those that are helping older people, like, for example, the chief service providers. And I think we found a lot of interesting stuff during this journey, and we try to always convert that into a guideline or a tool or something that can be used. A simple one is, and I think everybody here knows that, but it's always good to talk about that, how different, not just in levels, but how people, usually older people, would use technology if there is a need and an interest. There is no, I will learn technology for the sake of learning technology. And that need is very important, because that's what drives, trying to understand what to do with it. So for example, we developed a tool that is just a 20 yes or no questions that help very quickly identify what are your kind of interests. And because some people can be, the idea of one digital divide is a bit of fallacy, because there are multiple digital divides, and some people can be good with social Facebook, but very bad at banking. Others can be very good at banking, but terrible at creating anything that is not associated with that online. So it's hard to say you're good at something, we're bad at something. So it's very important to analyze where the needs are and how they prefer to learn. So this is one thing. The other thing is, everybody has talked a lot about, it's not just about skills, but also about the emotions around it, the fears. And we wanted to investigate more around that. So what we call perceived risks. Sometimes it's not about learning exactly how to do that, but it's mastering that fear. So but also the community has a wealth of knowledge around how to deal with these fears. So what we did is, can we co-create some strategies with older adults to see what can be done? And it was very interesting. We did many panels and produced a book around that. It's on the website as well, where we discovered that, simple strategies like, breathe, walk around the block. If there is that panic of the screen has gone dark, and what do I do? Just, sometimes call a friend. The computer is not going to move by itself. You can have a cup of tea and come back. These are very simple strategies, but they are playing on the emotional side, and that's really important. Sometimes even for people that are very good with technology, or they had a career in technology and now they retired, that can be challenging sometimes to be in front of others, being expected to perform some kind of knowledge of technology in front of others. And that embarrassment can also create this freezing effect. And all of these, so it's not about just the skills or the level of skills that are very important, but also trying to see what are these different perceived risks that we call different fears, and having those strategies. So we kind of created something around that. And finally, to your question, we also looked at the agents of socialization. So adult children and grandchildren, neighbors, peers, each one of them have their cons and pros. So adult children can help a lot, but they usually have no patience. They just give if we fix it for you. Grandchildren have a lot of patience, but then the information is not necessarily credible. So different ways of using your community, your peers. Peers are very good source of knowledge. At least they have the same rhythm and pace. So trying to understand better how to manage what's around and the different processes. Yeah. So I put all that in the website, which I think it's in the chat there at shapingconnections.org, and to make it public and to work with communities for that.
Super. Thanks so much for taking us through that. I'd like us to come back in a moment to that issue about socialization agents and the role of CHSP services in that context. But we're really fortunate to have Lisa Du with us from ReadyTech Go. Lisa's the founder of ReadyTech Go, which is a company in Melbourne that aims to enrich the lives of older adults with the confidence and skills to embrace modern technology. And I think, Lisa, your focus in your company is very much on personalised learning and making that human connection through technology, which, as I said, we tried to represent in some of the nice photographs in our guide. So I wonder, would you like perhaps to outline the approach that your company has taken, and what are the kinds of needs that you've identified over recent times in the people you work with? Oh, I think you need to unmute. Sorry, Lisa.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for the introduction. So like you said, we provide that one-on-one personalised technology lessons so that we can empower people with the skills and knowledge to embrace modern technology. All of our training is carried out at their own pace, in the comfort of their own home, with a patient and supportive trainer. And I guess most importantly, we write down step-by-step instructions for people. So the kind of needs that we're identifying in older adults that we support are that they want that one-on-one approach. Everybody learns differently. They all learn at a different pace. And while one person might call an icon a circle, someone else might call it a button. So we always use language and terminology that resonates with that person. And we write that terminology down as well, so they can refer back to it later. We're also seeing like an increase accessibility needs. So a lot of vision impairment, whether it's hearing impairment or just physical needs around getting around a device. So by working with that individual, we can really tailor our training around their needs. So I guess like more and more clients are feeling like they are being left behind because a lot of essential services are moving online, and they feel like they need to keep up to speed, not only to use the service, but so they can communicate with loved ones. And they just want to do this, I guess, in an environment that's comfortable to them, with someone that doesn't make them feel silly or yeah.
Fantastic. And Lisa, what would you say to CHSP providers in terms of that very basic issue of a consumer, a client who is really just not even at that readiness stage? How do you think a CHSP provider should approach getting someone to that ready stage?
Yeah, so I think that community service providers need to keep offering that mix of, I guess, traditional communication and a little bit of modern technology as well, and just giving them that choice so that they've got that ease and that comfort to give it a go if they're happy to give it a go. And if they want that help, they can. So I guess just as an example, we've been working with a client who's visually impaired. So I've been seeing her for weeks, teaching her how to use her iPhone with VoiceOver. And the other day she said, I finally made my first phone call, but she called the council and she got prompted to make a choice, you know, press 1 to be redirected to a certain department, but there was no choice to actually speak to someone. So she was so proud that she made a phone call. But in this instance, a business's take on technology to become more efficient really failed this client and their accessibility need.
It's a great example, isn't it? Thanks so much for that. Just before we move to the formal Q&A session, I wonder whether I might ask the panelists to make some comments about what support they think CHSP providers themselves might need to play an effective role in both improving their own communications, but also in supporting clients through this journey. I don't know, Gayle, can I put you on the spot to come in on that one?
Yes, you can. So providers, I think, need to think holistically about the clients, and community as at large has society has an expectation that we can use devices for people, or we can actually modify workplaces for people, but we don't think about seniors and the ability to actually help them to be supported with their technology use. So we use all sorts of devices to make people inclusive, but we don't actually think about that when it comes to seniors. So looking holistically at them, how can we communicate with them? What is their preferences? Can they use SMS? Can they use send a text message or just reply? Can they open an email? Can they download a document? So I wouldn't just be asking the standard question about how are you with technology. I'd be breaking it down to what ability that individual has.
Don, please.
Thank you.
I reckon that's great. I think one of the most basic things is the providers sit back and accept the fact that they've got to do this, because if they don't do it, you're going to have that communication divide between the provider and the recipient. But at the same time, you'll start to get negative responses from the people who are receiving these packages when they get that sort of information. They don't understand it.
That's a great point. And one tip we give, or suggestion in the guide, is for providers to be really alert to some of the signs that clients might be having some difficulties. It might be that they express frustration, impatience themselves, or that they just tune out. And so that's something we'd really love some feedback on over time. What should providers be looking out for in terms of whether they're getting it right in terms of using different platforms. Would anybody else like to have a go at that question, Suze?
Yes, look, I think it's important that providers find out what devices people have as well, what they're actually using. So in that whole onboarding process, if you actually were to ask those kind of questions, so you can see what technology they've got and ask what they're comfortable with. The other thing is having images that go along with your messaging on how to do things. It's really easy. It's a lot easier to follow photos or pictures of what to do in order of how to do them. And the other thing is, what services do people actually want to access? So it's people are more likely to access a service if that's the one they want. So if you teach them how to set up a MyGov account, things like that, things that people need, or even if it's to play a game, just something to get people in that process of using the technology, and that they actually get something out of it. And the other thing is, videos, like Services Australia has videos embedded in their websites for everything that maybe people aren't aware of. All you need to do is type in the little search bar what you're looking for, and there'll be a short YouTube clip on how you do it, and it'll show you how you set up this account, how you access these different things.
Yeah, that's great advice. Bernardo, and I know you want to make a comment. I wonder, could we also perhaps ask you as an expert in marketing and business to comment on what does it really mean for the older person to be the consumer in this sort of situation, and what should they be able to legitimately expect in terms of a CHSP service being responsive to their need for different types of communications?
Yeah, okay, well, that's a good question. So I'll first address the other one, because I just had a point that less is more in this case. Sometimes there is an understanding that you should provide all the different alternatives and all that, but in this situation, whenever it's cluttered, it's confusing, it's difficult. I like Susan's idea of the videos and all that, but the videos then have to be about one thing at a time, short videos. The information has really to come slowly. Once you put lots of information on a screen, on a message, if you have a step-by-step process that is too long, that also gets people, all these things, you have to think that less is more. Always. It's not about more technology necessarily. Now, that more about the communication, it's about trying to understand as much as possible how to frame that need of technology, also kind of embedded in things that people need. So if the example that you're using is too far from what you're trying to accomplish, it doesn't really work. The example needs to be very, you need to go into my aged care, and how are you going to do that? And I'm going to help you with trying to do that. But as a consumer, I think we think that that's what we find, that we tend to blame ourselves for not understanding, or for saying, oh, it's too complicated. I can't do it. We hear that a lot, when it's the provider's fault to not have created something that is easy to understand. People shouldn't have to find information at the very bottom of the screen, or have to look for it. The information should be in a different color at the center of the screen, very easy to find. So I really think that consumers, part of the consumer empowerment that we talk about, we try to, is for consumers to also understand their rights, and they should complain about things when they are not coming in a very easy and simple way. It's our right as consumers in general to have the information in a way that we can understand. And that applies also to called communities as well. Each one, I think there is a simplification of that it's just about language. If you want to reach out to called communities, it's just about language, and it's not. Different called communities have very different dynamics. Some called communities, the women are very savvy with technology because of the social networks they have to do, and the men are not savvy at all because of they had to work in, jobs that required manual labor and no technology at all, and that's kind of the result of that specific type of migration. Now, other communities, the other way around, the men dominate the technology and all that, but that has consequences on how you approach people and understanding their environments. So understanding their environments is key in this process.
Great. Perhaps Lisa, would you like to make any comments, given your strong emphasis on personalisation of this sort of education and training?
Yeah, no, everyone's made some really good points. And yes, you're right about making it simple. And that's our tagline, making technology simple. We're always trying to, if we're trying to teach them something, give them an example of how they can use it in their everyday life as well. So we're trying to teach them how they can read an email from their service provider, giving them a reason for them to practice so that they can then email their loved ones. Yeah, and also giving them tips and tricks. Like a lot of people can struggle to type on the keyboard. So we always show them functionality like how to dictate an email by using the little dictation button on their devices, and they just love that.
Great, great. Well, thanks so much for all those wonderful comments. You're not all quite off the hook yet. I'm going to pass back to Ben to run us through some audience Q&A, and look forward to some further comments in that context. Over to you, Ben.
Sorry, all. I just seem to be unable to start the video up again. But, oh, there we go. Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much to our panelists. I think that was so insightful, and I think honestly so practical. It was yeah, really, really great to hear. I'd encourage our attendees to please put any comments, questions, please put them in the chat. We will address them, put them to our panel. But in the meantime, I'd like to put a question to our panelists that we got at our last session, which was a little bit thorny and a little bit interesting. So I'd love to get your perspectives on it. In particular, today we are talking about inclusive communications from CHSP providers, but more generally, how can we make sure that planners of the system are aware of the need for inclusive communications? More broadly above CHSP providers, particularly this question was made in reference to the Commonwealth government removing inclusive methods of communication. And a classic example in Victoria, it was recently announced that information about basic services will no longer be advertised in print newspapers, which again is a key source of information we've found for older people. And so I'd love to get your perspectives on how you think we can make sure that some of the key messages that you've been outlining today and the key practical ways we can support older people factor into the decision making, especially with CHSP undergoing a reform process in the coming years. And so I wondered if I could get your thoughts, Bernardo, first.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. That actually, all these examples get me angry whenever I read about that or see this is happening. This is why I think in every action of the government, there should be a co-creation, element or co-design element where the action is actually cross, we get the feedback from older people in whether that should be done or not. There is a branch of the government that thinks that the best way to get people, older people on board of technology is just by kind of slowly turning off these different channels so that people can be forced to move into this. I think that's a very backward thinking process that people, the thinking behind that is that people will resist, and therefore you need to slowly, you know, kind of herd them into the technology. That's not the case at all. Usually people are very keen to learn new things as long as it's in their preferred way. So I think taking the time to ask the question in some co-creation sessions and all, what's the best way to do this? I think you would be surprised, the government especially would be surprised with some of the very creative solutions that people can come up that surprisingly tend to work when it comes from older people. So that's my reply to that.
I think that's a great point. It's co-creation, often talked about, rarely done. I think it's we've tended to find in government circles. Sue, I'd love to get your perspective on this, especially with the Tasmanian lens.
Oh, look, I don't know that it's purely Tasmanian. I guess the Tasmanian lens is that we often we have lots of black spots in connectivity. So, you know, where you can't use phones, you can't use computers. So that also needs to be factored in. You're sometimes not always able to communicate via digital technology. And maybe it's time that, you know, people are provided with devices and platforms to use if they're expected to use them. That's the other thing. You know, we did it with the education did it with students at school, providing them with laptops and things like that. So maybe my aged care could throw in some iPads or some type of the ones that the students don't use anymore. I don't know, you know, that we actually have devices and platforms on those devices that people can use. And not only that, training platforms are really great to be able to have a go at doing something. So whatever you're doing doesn't automatically go live. So if you make a mistake or want to have a practice at it, that's a really good way to engage people and get them to use those things if there's they can have a practice at it.
I think that's a great point, and it's you're getting us onto the issue of assistive technology, and it's something that, you know, I think is going to become increasingly important, and it's why COTA Victoria, we do lead the Assistive Technology for All program. So something to quick plug there for something that we do. But Gayle, do you have any thoughts on this issue?
No, but a recent experience I could share where I was trying to get a linking code for my father because we weren't able to do the transaction we were trying to do online. I said, don't worry, we'll ring and we'll get a linking code. We went round and round and round in circles. And at the end of the message, the voice operator said, all of that information can be found on our website. Thank you for calling. Goodbye. So we couldn't get a linking code even by calling. So, you know, that's where we need to have that co-cooperation and actually consultation to say that's not acceptable.
Yeah. It's I think it's really something where, you know, we can often talk about the things that providers or companies or businesses can make real practical changes for older people, but it's also making sure that there's that policy support or directive from the top that is enabling organizations to, you know, think of these things and be aware of these issues and, you know, be funded half the time to make sure that these practical supports can be delivered. Lisa or John, do you have any thoughts on this issue?
I was just going to say, yeah, so feedback from consumers, and then if we are going to make that change, we need to educate them. So I guess a few years ago when MyGov was kind of new, we just saw so many clients who were so confused about getting into MyGov because they didn't understand that they were sent a code to their mobile phones. And that was that two-step process. But I think today, now that more and more businesses are doing two-factor authentication, they're aware of that now because they've been educated.
Yeah. We do have one comment from Mary Kate. Bernardo is such an understanding person. I think that's very true, Bernardo. That's a good bit of feedback to receive on a Thursday afternoon. But I suppose
morning for me.
Oh yeah, well, yeah, even better. Great way to start the day. I suppose that sort of ties into something else I'm a bit interested in from you is, you know, how can we make sure, how can we make sure that this issue, especially around inclusive communications, is top of mind, particularly for people, say for instance, especially for CHSP providers, you've had a long day, you've been supporting people. How can we make sure, particularly say for instance at 4:15 on a Thursday, when maybe it's not, you're maybe not firing at 100%, how can we encourage people to make sure that they are thinking of inclusive communications at all time? It's a bit of a thorny question, but Lisa, do you have any thoughts?
I was going to say, have some empathy and put yourself in that client's shoes. Like, I guess a lot of the time they do feel like the world makes them feel silly with all these technology and they can't keep up to speed, and they just need your patience and your empathy and to communicate in a way that they're comfortable with.
Yeah, I think it's empathy. We all need it as much as possible, to be honest, in this day and age. John, do you have any thoughts, particularly from a consumer lens?
I'll give an example. 5 minutes to 5, 2 nights ago, my wife rang her service provider because the home cleaner didn't turn up, and she had the mobile phone on loudspeaker, and I was listening to the conversation, and I got the distinct impression that the person she was talking to was trying to rush the conversation because 5 o'clock was the time that we walked out the door. We don't come back to work until next morning. And after the conversation had finished, I picked up the phone immediately and rang this woman, and she answered the phone again, and she immediately apologised for the fact that she hadn't listened to the issue and sorted the issue out before she finished work for the day. Now, I'm not going to mention any names or providers, but that's a startling example of the light going on in the head and saying, heck, I'm not doing a good job here, so I will try and sort it out. But that's just a small example of the fact that I mentioned initially about 5 or 10 minutes ago, that providers have got to be aware of the fact that even if they think they are providing a great service, and if they are doing the right thing by the client, you've got to continue to talk to the client to find out, in fact, they understand and appreciate what's happening. Because I've seen many a time where somebody's walked away from a discussion and they didn't half understand what was going on, especially with the non-digital and digital communication. So you've got to have a really good mix of digital communication with non-digital communication. You've got to have empathy for the client and ensure that you have a discussion with them, not just 1, 2, 3, this is the way it's going to go. It's got to be, at COTA, we used to have peer educator meetings. We'll have 14, 15 peer educators sitting around and just chewing the fat about how we do things and the way we do things. And I think that's a really good method of ensuring that providers are on board and continue to keep up with what is an acceptable level.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, John, and really well put. I think it's a great example there. Sue, you put your hand up, or?
Yeah, sorry, the other thing I was going to, on the back of what John just said, is people being aware of the cost of things, that people don't often have, large plans on there that includes data and things like that. So if you're making apps, make sure they're kind of low data usage is the other thing. And service providers need to factor in what they're expecting from the users of their service, and maybe they could consider that cost as well.
Yeah, definitely true. I'm just mindful of the time, and I'd encourage any of our attendees, if you've got any, this is your last call, if you've got any questions, any comments, please put them in now. But I'd love to go through our panelists just to, if you've got any sort of final thoughts, if there's one thing our attendees or those who watch this session back, if there's one thing they take away from watching this, what do you want that to be? Sue, I'll pick on you, seeing as you just spoke, to go first. So apologies for that, but
the one thing I'd say is just ask. Just ask people.
Very true. Gayle?
Yes, I would be very keen for organisations to have some level of checklist that they can go through and say, is this person able to do this? Can they download a document? Can they upload a document? Can they send an email? Can they reply to an email? So taking it just that individual step, even do they have a printer? Because that's an important fact as well, because a lot of them won't have printers as well. So just making sure that there's something that gives staff the ability to check off the communication level, digital communication level with the consumer.
I think that's a great practical step. Great practical step. John?
One thing that I feel that providers should do with as part of the service is that they will pick up who's au fait and who isn't. And so the ones who aren't au fait, when they're providing services for them, at times, and this could come from probably the person who's looking after the total care of them, that they can turn around and give them examples of how they can increase their level of use of digital communication, and at the same time teach them how to do it or where they can go to do it as well. Because I honestly feel that some of the blokes that I talk to on a month-to-month basis, if they were given the opportunity to go and see the right people to get the basic 1 and 1 are 2 and 2 and 2 are 4 type things, and at the same time sit down and play with some of these digital devices so that the use of it and pushing the right button and not the fear of not pushing the right button or pushing the wrong button. I really think providers could kind of lay the foundations for that, and that would also help them in their communications with their own customers.
Another great practical suggestion. Lisa?
I'd say don't make assumptions. So if a client says that, yes, they can send an email. I actually saw a client who was happy to communicate with her service provider via email, but her service provider wrote an email that had about 5 or 6 questions, and the client didn't know how to respond to the actual question within that email because she thought, yeah, how do I reply? And she didn't understand that you can just reply on top. So yeah, ask the client and don't make assumptions.
That's a great example. That's a really good example. So that just leaves us with Bernardo.
Yeah, well, people have said great things already, that empathy, asking questions, resonating, remembering there is an emotional side associated with, the strategies around it. And also don't assume that there is a thorny issue around others helping, which is, don't assume that a family member is necessarily helpful. And sometimes it can be very helpful, but in other times they are not. And then just like forcefully involving, oh, can you call your daughter? Can you call your son? If it's something about bank and you don't want the children to be involved in that because it's a private issue, don't assume necessarily that the son or daughter is going to. So as I like the advice that Lisa gave as in ask first, because it's I think it was Lisa, sorry, but I just escaped it, because it's about understanding what are the needs and embedding that into the way that you can. After all, it's all about the relationship, and you need to cultivate that relationship more than just transmitting knowledge.
Yeah, another great point, and that I think for us, that example really chimes with us, especially the experience of elder abuse and its relation to financial situation, and it's remarkable how often a lot of the issues that we address in terms of older people, it's holistic. Everything is interconnected. Things do feed into each other. So No, I think that's a really, really great point to end our panel discussion and Q&A on. I'd really like to thank once again all of our panelists. It was some absolutely great contributions in the initial part, and I think some really great answers there that really sort of illuminated some great key points that people can take away from this session. If everyone picks up on the message around asking and empathy, I think we're going to see a lot of happy people engaging with their CHSP providers, which is really, really great to see, and that's the sort of practical element that we want to see. But before I send you all on your way, I would just like to flag that as we wrap up, a feedback survey will shortly be sent to you via email, and we really, really appreciate any feedback we can get, so we can help improve these types of events, or even start to look at, for instance, how we can take this sort of engagement and work even further. We also have a QR code, which is helpfully on the screen, and as was mentioned earlier, everyone got a bit au fait with the QR codes during COVID. So if you'd like to do it that method, then we'll give you an opportunity just now to do so. But a link to a recording of this webinar will be sent out separately within the next week. We already have our first webinar hosted on our website, so you can find it there, and we'll send you the link to that as well, so you'll be able to access everything we discussed today. This includes an advanced copy of the resource guide, as well as a survey to provide further feedback on the product and ideas of further action. I would like to thank you all so much for your participation today. Of course, our panelists, and of course, Martin, for leading this webinar and for leading so much of this work, and such a really, we think at least, a really valuable resource. But also particularly, we'd love to thank all of our attendees. Please spread the message to your colleagues. We will be sending, we film these webinars so their lessons can be learned now, but also into the future. So once again, thank you to everyone. Please enjoy your Thursday evenings, and thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.